Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. This is Dr. Hawthorn here, and today we will continue our series of command with Dr. Hawthorn. But today I'm not going to show you any modifiers or any tools. We will be talking about world origin, 3D cursor, and origins. These three elements are very important to us in Blender. It helps with transformation, locating the objects in the viewport or in the world that we are creating or in the scene that we are creating. And they are so important that it will also affect how you are going to, for example, use or apply a modifier to the elements. So, are you ready? Let's talk about the world origin. Now, the world origin is one of a kind. It's the only one in the 3D viewport that is irreplaceable. That is the 000 if you look at the coordinates. And as you can see, we are now in Blender, and if I use N to toggle the list on the right hand side, we will of course have the numbers, the transformation of the cube, because now we have the cube selected. And when we select the cube here, we will see that the location is 0M on all X, Y, Z axis. And the rotation is all zeroed out. Scale is all 1 to 1 to 1. And dimension is 2 meters times 2 meters. And this is the default setting and the default cube that we have in Blender. Now, this 000 in the location, meaning that this is the 3D coordinates, meaning that the three axes they intersect. Where they intersect is the world origin. And we have to remember that the world origin is 000. And if we just pan around, as you see here, if I pan to the back, or if I pan to the front, or if I pan to the right, to the left, I don't see any intersection of the axis. This is the only intersection at the center of the world, no matter how big it is, no matter how small it is. We have only one intersection, and this is the world origin. I'm repeating myself many times because I want you to remember that we have only one world origin, and this world origin is helping you to relocate yourself. Of course, if we have so many different items in the scene, and if we want to relocate, we want to recenter ourselves in the object or on the objects that we want to focus on, we just have to select the object and tap on the dot on our numpad. And then we will realign ourselves, we center ourselves here. And now, this is the world origin, but why I can use dot to recenter myself? That is because I'm referring to the origin of the mesh that I have. For example, if I am now using Shift A to add a cone, and I just grab it elsewhere, and now I'm selecting the cube, I use dots, I'm recentering myself in the center of the cube. But if I'm selecting the cone and I use dot on the numpad, I'm recentering myself at the cone. In this case, it means that I am taking reference to the origin of the mesh. And what is the origin of the mesh? As you can see that we have this orange dot in the center or almost the center of the cone. Or if I'm selecting the cube, I have also an orange dot at the center, at the heart of the cube. This is called origin. Origin is the pivot point of the objects or the element. If we have, of course, if we have the camera also has an origin. If we are selecting the light also has an origin. Each element we are creating here within the viewport, they will have one specific origin to themselves. Now, this origin is the pivot point or the center point of the objects. Where is it going to be if we are just moving things around under object mode, like what we are doing here now? If we're doing this, that the origin will stay, for example, this cube having the origin at the center of the cube, and under object mode, even if I want to move it away, the origin will stay at the center of the cube. It will move along the cube. And now, as you can see, the location will be different than just now. Just now we have 0, 0, 0. This is not because the cube has a mass. The location is not talking about the entire mass of the cube. Instead, it's talking about the origin of the cube. It is only a very, very small point that doesn't have any mass. In terms of mathematics, of course, we can see that the number will be 0, 0, 0 because it has no margin around the point. And if we move it to the side, for example, as you can see here, that the number is altered. And these numbers is exactly talking about where the origin of this cube is. Again, in Blender, every number here, we can look at it as a calculator. We can just reset the number here by placing these numbers with 0. By changing the number here under the location, the cube is moved back to the world origin because these numbers are based on the world origin. Around the world origin, we have the 3 coordinates. And that's why if we zero it out, it will move back to the world origin. The same apply to the cube at the cone. Now, if I select the cone, as you can see that the number of the cone is so far away. And if we put 0 to the cone and we recenter it, the cone is inside the cube because they are sharing the same location now. In this case, the origin of the object, now you can see that it is telling you where the location of the object is if the origin of the mesh is at the center of the mesh. This can be moved, but before we actually set the origin of the mesh elsewhere, we have to talk about this specific element here. It is like a cursor. It is called 3D cursor. This 3D cursor, we can have the function here, the button cursor, set the cursor location, drag to transform. Meaning, if we are selecting this, and if we just drag our mouse, so press on the mouse and drag, you can see that this 3D cursor is moving along with your mouse cursor. For now, you probably won't know exactly where your 3D cursor is because it's not telling you unless you are dragging it. If you are dragging it and if you pay attention to what we have here on the upper left corner, you can see that the dx is -5, dy is 5, dz is 10. You more or less know where your cursor is. It's not very precise, but you will have the coordinates. These 3D cursor will determine where you add the new element to. For example, I have the 3D cursor here, not at the center of the world. If I'm adding a cylinder, for example, I'm going to add the cylinder not precisely at the world origin, but I am adding the cylinder around my 3D cursor. So you see that the cylinder will be around my 3D cursor and the origin of the cylinder will be inside the heart of the 3D cursor. Of course, if I want to reset this cylinder back to the world origin, I can also do that. I just have to zero it out at the location, right? But this is actually very helpful because if I'm setting the 3D cursor, for example, if I'm setting the 3D cursor on the top of the cube, and if I'm adding another element, it will do the alignment automatically as I add the other element to the scene. Let me get rid of the cone and the cylinder first. I can also put the 3D cursor here, but I will never know if I am putting it really at the center of the top face of the cube. What I can do is to go back to the selection box, select the cube, and either if I want to start from the center of the cube, I can use Shift S in the object mode. Shift S is to set our 3D cursor to selected. This is one of the functions that I love using so much that I'm setting this 3D cursor at the point I selected. If I'm selecting the cube and the cube is so big, how do I determine where I'm selecting exactly? If we are under the object mode, that means I'm selecting where the origin of the cube is. In this case, I press this. I'm resetting the 3D cursor back at the origin of the cube. And now, if I'm adding any new thing, for example, if I'm adding a UV sphere, it will add around the cube, right? Another possibility is to get yourself into the edit mode of this element. Tap to the edit mode. Either we use the vertex select. I can use vertex select to select this specific vertex. Shift S, opening this panel to set the cursor to select it. I'm setting the cursor to this very specific vertex, and if I'm adding anything to the scene now, for example another cube, I'm adding the cube around that 3D cursor, around that vertex. Or if I'm using the edge select, for example, I'm selecting this edge. This edge is so large that if I am setting my 3D cursor to selected, it means that I'm setting my 3D cursor at the center of this selected edge, which is exactly in the middle point. If you see here, you see that it divided the entire edge very evenly, and it is at the center of this very edge. And if I'm adding sphere here, it will be very well aligned to this edge. We can also, let me get rid of this sphere, we can also select the face. If I'm selecting this face and set the cursor to selected, I will set the cursor to the center of this face. You see? And now, if I'm adding a cone meaning that we have the peak point very sharp, and if I'm moving this entire cone down, you see that the center of the cone is exactly at the center of the top face. In this case, setting the 3D cursor by using some other elements or some other specific elements so small like a vertex, an edge, or a face will help us taking it as the reference to create new objects. We can also select, for example, if I'm too lazy to change it back to all select the entire cube, I can also take the very top face of the cube and the very bottom face of the cube. Now I have selected two faces. Imagine if I'm setting the 3D cursor to selected, where exactly my 3D cursor will fall onto. That is precisely the origin of the mesh, because I am taking the center of each face, and at the center of each face, for example, I have the center of the top face and the center of the bottom face, and where is the center of the two centers I have selected? It is the origin of the mesh. Or if I am using edge select, selecting this edge and that edge is actually the same as selecting this side face. Cursor to selected, you see I am putting the cursor in the center of this side face. If, for example, if I'm changing a new cube, now in this cube, if I'm changing the origin, I want to change this origin to this vertex, or let's say I want to change the origin of the cube to this edge. Selecting this edge, what I need to do is to I'm setting the origin to selected and going back to the object mode, what I need is to click Object, Set Origin is to set the origin of the mesh to something else. Here we have the options of geometry to origin, which we already have the geometry at the origin, or the origin to geometry. It is for you to just put back the origin to the geometry if they are separated. And how do we separate them? Is actually going into the edit mode. For example, if I am grabbing the entire mesh away, because we are inside the edit mode, and whenever we are inside the edit mode, the origin of the mesh will not be moved. And so now, for example, if we have the case like this, of course, the origin of the mesh is so far away from the mesh itself. But anyway, it is not what we are talking about now. What we are talking about is to set this origin to the point here. I have to go back to the object mode, going to Object, Set Origin, Origin to 3D Cursor. Once I click that, you see what is at the center is no longer here, it's gone. And what I have here is actually having the origin of the mesh here along this edge, at the center of this edge with the 3D cursor. And at the very beginning, I have told you that the origin is actually the pivot point of that mesh. In this case, if I am taking this mesh and if I'm going to just scale it up, I am scaling it up along this edge. This is different from if we have the cube here. I'm scaling it around this origin at the center. It is also the same if we want to do rotation along the x-axis. If I'm rotating this cube along the x-axis, you can see I'm rotating by having the center of the origin of the cube as my reference, as my pivot point. But if I'm doing this on this cube, the same command, rotation on x-axis, you see the cube will be rotated around the pivot point, which is the center of the other edge. In this case, for example, open the door, we can also take the opportunity by selecting the, for example, here. Let me get rid of this and reset the cursor to world origin. Adding a new cube. Now I have a cube. For example, if I want to take this as the door, take this face as the door, what I need to do is to take the face, use P to separate the selection. And this is one command that I will talk about it in detail. I'm separating this face, as you can see, I'm separating this face from the rest of the cube. And now this face is having the origin at the back of the face because I'm taking the same origin of the cube here. If I go to the edit mode of this face, and if I'm using to select the side edge here, setting the cursor to selected, going back to the object mode, set the origin to 3D cursor. For example, this face I have selected with the pivot point along the right edge here. What I need to do, or what I can do, is to lock the rotation of x-axis and y-axis, leaving the rotation only possible to the z-axis. And now if I'm pressing R to rotate this face, I'm rotating the face like rotating a door. You see, I can open the door, or I can close the door, I can push it to the other side because I'm taking this specific edge as the pivot point. This is how we can manipulate the location of the 3D cursor, the origin of the mesh, and how we can make use of them to help you do modeling even easier without too much effort to align things or to have specific rotation or transformation to your meshes. We will talk more about this in the future using this very same technique for the convenience of applying other modifiers. If you want to know more, stay tuned, and in this series, you will definitely learn a lot more useful things. See you! Bye!